We are here with independent journalist Lee Fang, whose Substack, leefang.substack.com. We encourage you all to subscribe to. Lee, great to meet you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course.
So you're broadcasting from that festering hellhole we've heard about, San Francisco. Is it as apocalyptic as they say?
I mean, yes and no. I've lived here for 12 years and it has deteriorated. It's kind of degentrified as people have left because of, COVID restrictions and tech work from home and just the general quality of life issues that you see ad nauseum on conservative media. And yeah, there are big issues. Homelessness and drug addiction, property crime are, unprecedented. It's a West Coast issue. It's not unique to San Francisco. Portland, LA, Seattle has similar dynamics. But in San Francisco, I think it's just particularly, it's a crisis in part because of the contrast. This is the Bay Area. This is the greatest engine of wealth creation possibly in human history, or at least in modern times. You have all these multi-billion-dollar mega tech companies, these unicorns, all this wealth, and mired within it, you have some of the worst poverty and crime. So yeah, it's a big problem. And, San Francisco as a political entity is just kind of fundamentally broken. A big bureaucracy. There's lots of money spent on education and homeless services, but very poor results. So, the blame goes all around. There's left and right wing critiques that both ring true about the city.
Is it a supply issue too? I mean, San Francisco is such a small city compared to, even LA or New York, or Chicago. I mean, you said it's a West Coast thing. I know Portland is a fairly small city as well. Does that have something to do with it? That there's just not housing for people? Like there's not as much of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the space limitations in terms of geography. It's a peninsula surrounded by water. There's 7x7 city, not that large, and very, very powerful small d democracy neighborhood groups that lobby against any new housing construction. You have entire neighborhoods on the west side, central part of the city, that haven't had any new home construction since the turn of the century, 1910s, after the earthquake. There's all these beautiful Victorians that are basically frozen in time, and people prefer this kind of neighborhood feel, so they lobby very rigorously against any new housing construction. But it's supply and demand, basic market economics. When you have a desirable city and no housing construction, well, the price goes up.
Right.
Yeah, I said, because I was traveling out to LA a lot for Jimmy's show during the winter. And last year I went to India and I went to Italy, I went to Greece, and I said, I'm not going to say that LA is like India, but it's more like India than it is like Greece or Italy. You have just that stark wealth inequality, that kind of decayed infrastructure that really evokes third world conditions, just in LA. Now, San Francisco, we actually had somebody, because I've pushed back on the kind of New York is failing industrial complex. You have all these grifters who make a fortune feeding confirmation bias. There's a lot of people out there who like that morality tale of the liberal cities are failing. And those videos, millions of views to feed that confirmation bias. So I said, well, maybe it's the same thing with San Francisco, but you're telling me not really.
Yeah, I mean, no, there are people who exaggerate the problem. It's still, in terms of violent crime, actually very low. Not that many homicides for a big or relatively medium-sized big American city. Not that much violent crime in general. Property crime is high, though. You get your windows smashed if you leave it parked in many different neighborhoods. I've walked through different neighborhoods. I've seen a dead body of someone passed out and paramedics coming to pick them up. I don't think you see that in most American cities.
I've never seen it, and I'm a native New Yorker.
Yeah, and I've seen this twice now in San Francisco. It's
Oh,
It's
wow.
heartbreaking, and it just doesn't seem like something that would happen in any wealthy, industrialized country, whether it's
Right.
Japan or Italy or whatever, what have you. And yeah, I've been to New York. That there's a very active policing presence that helps deter some of this. And there's some issues with New York policing. We don't have to get into that, but in San Francisco, it just seems that for big parts of the city, the cops have absconded, and there's literally no cop on the beat to deter some of these crimes or issues. And it is kind of, I was in Brazil last year, and I had a similar feeling. I've never been to India, but I was in Rio, and you have wealthy neighborhoods that have lots of police and lots of private security. There are gigantic walls and gates.
Right.
And there's incredible levels of poverty in the favelas and the hills, and it's such a stark contrast in terms of safety, in terms of wealth disparity, and San Francisco's not there yet. It's not to that degree, but it feels like it's headed in that direction.
Yeah, I feel like, as a New Yorker, I feel like whenever a New Yorker goes on vacation or goes on a trip to another city, they're always perplexed by the lack of cops on the street. And then whenever, because as someone who used to work in New York tourism, and so is Russ, when people come from different cities to New York, they're always amazed by how many cops there are everywhere. That's something
that is Giuliani's true permanent legacy in New York. That was really what he left us.
And don't get if you want to see there's a focus on San Francisco because of the tech and the Nancy Pelosi and Kamala, political issues and liberal kind of cultural beacon dynamic. But talk about depolicing. Oakland, which has high homicide, high property crimes, high crime in general, lots of poverty, and there's no police. I mean, the number you call 911 in that city, you're waiting hours even for a violent crime for a response. And it's kind of it's both a left and right wing thing. People say it's wokeness, it's depolicing, it's cutting police funding. That's true. They did cut police. They have these big kind of activist groups that pressure the city against active policing, but it's also an austerity issue. It's a poor city that can't afford the cops either. It's both. It's a city that's deindustrialized, that big part of the tax base is left. They can't afford it either. So there are two dynamics that are both problematic in terms of no police. I mean, Oakland is people focus on San Francisco, but Oakland's it's a much bigger tragedy.
Well, they lost two major sports teams, right? They're going to lose the A's, and they already lost the Oakland Raiders.
Yeah, that's right. Vibe is not good.
No vibe.
All right. Whenever we do an interview, I always think of the boxing line. Everyone's got a plan until they get hit.
Yeah.
So that was unplanned, but hey. All right, so let's get into the some of the stuff we wanted to ask you. All right, so you did the White House Correspondence dinner article recently, and I've long had a thing about it, as a lot of people do. I don't think there's any event that more demonstrates the Versailles-like nature of our politics than the White House Correspondence dinner. But your article had an interesting angle on this. Like a lot of these, just really opulent, over-the-top, disgusting displays of wealth and insider status, it's covered up with a veneer of charity. So I've never seen anyone really get into this, but in your article, you lay out the numbers. The event raised $133,000 for 30 scholarships, a little over $4,000 per students, and they get a tour of the White House. To provide context on this paltry scholarship number, consider how much is spent on the weekend. A single corporate media outlet will often shell out as much as $200,000 on the political glitz and glam fest to entertain A-list guests. The venues sponsoring after-party events for the dinner charge a minimum of $250,000 for a few hours of cocktail snacks. There are countless invite-only brunches, happy hours, and side events employing a small army of caterers. Throw in the first-class tickets, hotel suites, chauffeurs, private security, and all the rest. Many millions of dollars are spent in a few short days purely for beltway vanity. But the thin facade of a scholarship is perhaps appropriate for the event. what better way to illustrate the nature of establishment politics and journalism than a public interest farce? Now, obviously, you're not going to get invited. What do you think? Where do you think the journalists who are in that room are coming from? Do they actually believe the narratives that they push out to the public because they're drawn from a similar social class to the people that they're covering? Taibbi writes about that all the time. Journalists used to be working class and now they're drawn from the upper class. Or is it that they just want that access and don't really care? Like, what's your take? What are these journalists thinking who are in that room?
Well, I guess before I rip into the dinner, I will say that, there's a nice aspect. We're very polarized in the media and in politics. Everyone's supposed to hate each other and be at each other's throats. And this is supposed to be a night where the politicians, Republicans and Democrats, come together. Right-wing and left-wing media come together. Everyone kind of dines together. I don't think there's anything wrong with that aspect, but the class aspect, the fact that, there's supposed to be an adversarial dynamic between reporters and the government, and you have this moment where there are many journalists doing a very good job who are aggressive and investigating and pushing back on government and corporate lies. But for the most part, at big, mostly mainstream legacy media outlets, it's a symbiotic relationship. You get these beat sweeteners where you write a positive piece about a politician or a powerful person. They then basically give you inside access and give you the scoop. So the big political announcement, before legislation drops, they're given a pre-read so they can do a pre-write. So they have the first piece. They get fed all these morsels of information and access, so that essentially, we don't have state-run media. I guess there's Voices of America, but generally no government directly controlled media. But this culture of back scratching and backslapping that's in DC, in effect creates de facto state media, where the major reporters and press outlets are carrying water for the military and political class. And this night kind of encapsulates a lot of that, because they're coming together, and it's this, as you said, this show of like, it's like Versailles. It's celebrities, billionaires, all kind of feeding each other and celebrating the role of the Washington press. I mean, it seems phony for anyone, I think, especially in this moment where there's been kind of a deterioration of trust in the media. But it's been the same dynamic for decades, where anyone outside who really follows this type of thing scratches their head and says, what is this? It doesn't really make sense. And I've kind of casually known about this. I know people who attend these things. I didn't even realize this was a scholarship event until a friend actually texted me who was there. And he said, did you know this was a scholarship event? And did you know they just raised basically $100,000? I mean, they're spending probably about $10 million on this event, if you had to add all this together. And they're doing this fig leaf of public service. It's just, it perfectly speaks to the kind of foundation charity world of DC that is a thin veneer for corporate lobbying or influence peddling. It's just, it's unseemly. Like, you remember those stories about the Trump Foundation from the Washington Post and others that are like, oh, this, the Pulitzer Prize, big scoop that, Trump gave a small amount of charity for these foundations that were supposed to be for veterans and others. It's like, well, hey, look, the Washington Post and all of their other buddies in the media do the same thing to feed themselves, but they don't add that scrutiny because it's them doing it. If it's Trump doing it, he's the worst person in the world. And, Trump deserves scrutiny for that. Those kind of phony foundations he was running. This is the exact same dynamic.
Well, that degradation in trust of these sort of legacy outlets has created an opening for people like us, and by us I also mean people like you who are now on Substack. I mean, Substack is an amazing tool. It seems to me like these are kind of the best of times and the worst of times, in the sense that it is, in theory, easier than ever to start your own outlet and publish your own material. At the same time, that floods the field where it can be difficult to gain a foothold. So you're someone who kind of, you wrote for the Intercept for a while. Now you're on your own. What prompted you to make that transition? And how has it been for you? What do you think? What is your read on the landscape for independent journalists such as yourself and anyone who may want to follow in your footsteps?
It's a very good time for people like me and for us, for people in the independent media to carve out our own little niche, to create a financial model where we can make this possible. I don't think this would have been possible even a few years ago.
Right.
It's very good. There's also big problems with independent media. There isn't the same type of scrutiny in terms of fact checking and editorial standards. And there's the dynamic of audience capture that, okay, if you're getting money just from your subscribers, then, if you have viewpoints or news that you want to break that might challenge the assumptions of your subscribers, you might self-censor, or, you might just start pandering. That's a big problem too. This isn't a perfect model. If I had my druthers, and if I could craft a perfect system, I would want a strong constellation of establishment media, big newspapers, magazines, TV shows, radio shows. I mean, I don't want them all working in concert to say the same thing, but I do want large organizations that have fact checkers and reporters on the beat who are doing, their own type of thing. In addition to a strong independent media of YouTubers, of bloggers, of independent reporters who are kind of outside the mainstream, who are questioning conventional wisdom. I think between the two, that's the best way to find truth. Because it's difficult to find all the answers of, in terms of public phenomenon or political crises. We're all kind of doing what we can. So we don't have that. We have like a deteriorating mainstream press, and still kind of a struggling independent press that's coming into its own. So I'm trying to be honest. I'm trying to kind of follow old school journalistic ethics. Trying to be rigorous in all my reporting. I'm doing both opinion commentary and investigative reporting. I'm trying to be fair-minded and ethical, but it's tough. Being on your own isn't easy, but I am enjoying it, and it's worked out really well because it's given me a lot of editorial freedom. The Intercept was a great place to work. It kind of fell victim to the same type of ideological capture that I think a lot of other press outlets have gone through. There's kind of a motivation.
What kind would you say?
Well, I don't know if it's easy to explain exactly the genesis of this, because I think a lot of people assume that because the Intercept was funded by Pierre Omidyar, it's a big Democratic donor, that there's this pressure to be a certain, have a certain ideology or partisan bent. I don't think that was really, that might have played some role. I don't know, but maybe in terms of some of the editors hiring, some of the hiring, but in general, the kind of ideological partisan capture just came from the ideology of the type of people who are hired. There are folks who really hated conservatives. This was a left-wing outlet, really hated Republicans, and had these strong beliefs around, the issue we just talked about with San Francisco around abolishing the police, right, or some kind of like strong left-wing views. And I'm okay with kind of any view if you're willing to debate it or be open to countervailing perspectives. But a lot of these folks were not open to those other perspectives and really wanted to vilify anyone with a different point of view. And that's not journalism. That was a big issue. The Intercept started as an adversarial independent outlet that was really questioning power and holding government and corporations accountable. And it kind of drifted into left-wing culture war, where we had all these debates around pronouns, and we had to go back and people wanted to go back and edit our stories to say, if you said congressman, it has to be changed to congressperson. Maybe that's okay, but like, is this really the top priority of all the issues we have in society? And we got to call Trump a fascist. It's like, I don't know if journalism really comes from I don't think a central part of journalism is this accusation culture of like embedding cultural cues into your prose.
Right.
It's just it's finding facts and reporting them and providing analysis that's accessible to people. Maybe there's a place for this kind of pronoun debate. I don't know. I found it to be a distraction. I found the policing debate and many of these other kind of like identity politics debates to be an unprincipled distraction because, I don't know, from my view, like racial identity in particular is a construct that is always changing. And, to take this deterministic view that, all white people are oppressors and all people of color are victims. It's just, it doesn't hold true to my experience of reporting or my experience in society. It's not helpful in terms of how you run a journalistic institution, and it's not unique to the Intercept. A lot of left-wing kind of media outlets had this crisis. I don't, so in terms of where this came from, whether it's the donors, the owners of the Intercept, or just the type of people who go to work at these kind of places, it's probably a little bit of both.
I mean, it seems there was a real sort of partisanship issue there too. Glenn Greenwald famously quit because they would not run his Hunter Biden laptop story. So that's even more shallow than your sort of ideological bent or your philosophical bent. That is something as shallow as, okay, there's an election in a few weeks. We're not running this because it's going to hurt our candidate. Like, I feel like that's even more superficial than to say this violates our philosophical stance as an outlet. And that seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back for him.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, candidly, there was a lot of concern at the Intercept at the high levels that because of reporting that I did, that Glenn did, and others in 2016 that was critical of Hillary Clinton, critical of the Democratic Party, that, we had to somehow make up for it by being extra critical. I don't know, of maybe pulling back some punches or
so
promoting.
It wasn't Russia, it was actually you.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, I don't know. It's one of these things. It's like it's multifactorial. There's a lot of dynamics. And there was this concern that maybe we downplayed the Russian influence, but it's like, if anything, Glenn got that right. I think a lot of other reporters at the Intercept got it right, but they didn't get credit for it. If anything, they got kind of punished for it, for actually being correct on these issues that actually placed them in the correct context. That yes, there was some Russian meddling, but it was such a small factor, and that it was used in a cynical way by the Democratic elite to basically wash away all the other issues that the Democratic Party has, whether that's ties to big banks or corruption. And it was a scapegoat issue. It's an issue used to kind of unfairly go after Trump, and to wash the Democratic Party's hands clean of all its other issues. I mean, I'm proud of the Intercept's early reporting and what Glenn and I and others had written and wrote about on this dynamic, but it caused a lot of tension internally at the Intercept, where there are people from a very different point of view. And that was a big problem.
Yeah, it's a real shame. I mean, what a great team. I mean, Glenn, Scahill's very good at what he does. I mean, and they had the resources to sort of assemble this great team of writers, and be able to put out, some very, very strong content on a regular basis. But it sounds like they just fell victim to the kind of, I mean, I hate to use a term as cliche at this point as Trump derangement syndrome, but that carries special weight, especially in light of recent events. And this is not to blame anybody for anything. I'm for free speech. People should be able to say whatever they want about whatever politician they want to. But when you look at the timeline, and it sounds like what you're saying is that there was a major shift during those Trump years, between 2016 and the end of his first term. And now here we are again, Trump campaign number 3. And we all know what happened last weekend.
Well, look, actually, to tie it together a little bit, I mean, after Trump's election, there were also demands within the staff of the Intercept to promote violence, to say that, okay, this is because this is fascism, and maybe there's a logical argument here, even though I don't agree with any of it. But if you believe that this is a rise of fascism, that we should be endorsing Antifa and violence on the streets. It's like morally, ethically, and practically, I disagreed with that. So that led to some tension within the Intercept staff. But we're coming full circle where we're seeing the role of political violence in a major election, and thank God Trump was not seriously harmed. It's a tragedy that someone was killed at that rally, but I think for a lot of these debates in 2017 and 2018, early in the Trump administration, it was still kind of abstract. Like, okay, some people with baklavas are beating up, other people, other like political people in the streets in Berkeley or something, and it's something that people in Brooklyn or DC could cheer on, thinking that violence is something fun that we can just uncork in society, and it won't have a spiraling effect that could lead to something serious. I think this moment last Saturday in Pennsylvania is a grim reminder that violence is something that it's not something just to joke about on the internet or to promote, thinking that just one side will benefit. I mean, it's something that it can lead to recriminations and revenge, and something maybe much darker for society.
Well, that's what I said on the show last night. We covered the assassination attempt. Look, if I'm being honest, I've seen the left openly endorse violence as a political tactic over the last several years, much more than I've seen the right, the mainstream of the right, do that. Sure, you've got your Charlottesville people, but on the so-called left and among Democrats, I mean, look at how they reacted to the assassination. We couldn't even show the memes I wanted to show because we might have gotten a strike from YouTube. If the right reacted that way to an assassination attempt on Biden, that would be all you would hear on the media. So that's a good segue into the Dissident Dialogues. All right, so I saw you actually did a sit down with Winston, who I'm going to invite on, because as you know, we did that short interview outside. I was very critical of a kind of uniformity of foreign policy in that festival, particularly in regards to Israel, in regards to Ukraine, in regards to China, in regards to Iran. I saw nothing at that festival that could not have come out of an Anthony Blinken PowerPoint presentation, which I thought was remarkable for a festival called the Dissident Dialogues. Particularly now on your panel, that was the only panel where they had just, I forget the name of the act, they just passed the act in Congress of trying to essentially criminalize being anti-Israel on college campuses, or anti-Zionist, I should say. And everybody, that's all well and good. Everyone agreed that that was a bad bill. I don't think that was mentioned anywhere else the entire weekend, and it had just passed a couple of days before. So now you get a lot of people. I spoke to Winston and Desh afterwards. I did an interview with both of them. And they said, and I believe them, that they had a hard time getting anyone who represented any other point of view to agree to do it. And talking to Brianna, I caught up with Brianna Joy Gray there, and she told me what it took for them to get her to do it. So I know they wanted to, because they met her requests without getting into detail to get her there. So I take them at their word there. But my question is really, why so many people in the so-called intellectual dark web, right? Dawkins, McWhorter, Pinker, Brett Weinstein, they're all pro-Zionist, like absolutely no variation in opinion, and generally on Russia, on Ukraine. That is very surprising to me from people who really pride themselves on being intellectually dependent. Where do you think that comes from? Why is that?
It's a good question. I've struggled with that as well. There's no particular tribe, and that's a good thing. And maybe I should not join any movement or label for my ideas or my principles or values. maybe I don't fit in anywhere, and I'm fine with that because I was kind of vaguely associated with parts of the progressive left, but then on issues of identity, of public safety, and on some of these issues around Russia, I felt kind of excommunicated, and maybe it wasn't appropriate for me to affiliate in any way, although I had no official affiliation. It's really just kind of,
Right.
you kind of get grouped in these type of things. And on this kind of anti-woke IDW world, because I was critical of censorship, critical of efforts to, the cancel culture dynamic of shutting people down who have simple, genuine differences of opinion and different viewpoints, I kind of got grouped in with this world. And, again, like I don't want to subscribe to anyone else's beliefs because, in my view, there is quite a bit of hypocrisy here. The way that the term anti-Semitism is used as a intellectual shortcut, as kind of a rhetorical shortcut to shut down debate around foreign policy, around what Israel does in terms of its relation to its neighbors and its relationship to the Palestinians, is identical to the way that the term racist or transphobe or neo-Nazi is used in the domestic context to shut down conservative speech. This kind of fragility of victimhood of saying, we've got to have speech codes and censorship and safe spaces to protect Jewish students from any of these debates, is the exact same formulation that we heard for a decade from liberals as they were making up excuses to shut down conservative speakers. Now, of course, there are racists in society. There are anti-Semites. That is dangerous. But as I think a lot of these IDW people have articulated in other areas, the best response to bad speech is better speech.
Right.
You're not going to make this go away by strangling it, by forcing people with new hate speech codes or social media censorship to shut up about a real phenomenon, a real policy issue. I mean, this is a big debate that we should be having in society about what our country is doing in terms of providing this aid and military assistance to what Israel is doing in our name, essentially. I wish we could have an evidence-based, rational discussion around these decisions by our government that isn't clouded by attempts to cancel and stigmatize. And it's unfortunate that I don't think everyone's in this world. There's quite a few people when I've gone to some of these conferences that pull me aside and say, look, I wish we had a bigger debate on these Israel issues, on Russia and Ukraine and some of these foreign policy issues. It doesn't make sense that it's not a bigger issue, especially given like what I've written about in the last few weeks, that there's Israeli intelligence officers who are creating social media censorship groups that are working with the big platforms that is identical to the same type of censorship that we just talked about in these same IDW forums around COVID and around identity politics.
Well, that's what's so remarkable. Because after October 7th, they all flipped on a dime. And as someone who I think, like yourself, is in empathy with a lot of their views that they had been expressing about censorship and the culture wars, I've covered a lot of those subjects, and I'm very aligned with a lot of points of view expressed by a lot of those figures. I've enjoyed a lot of McWhorter's observations about DEI. I agree with them. And to see all of these figures just have one opinion about Israel, what's so bothersome about it is, as you know, if you're kind of nominally left, I think it's fair to say, you're constantly trying to argue with people on the left who have swallowed a lot of these cultural precepts and argue, no, to oppose this is not Western chauvinism. It's not about that. And then as soon as October 7th happened, I think they discredited everything that they had said before because they proved their critics right. How do you explain it other than, well, at core, you're just Western chauvinists, and Israel is a more Western coded country in your eyes than their enemies. So you just align with them without really digging into the rights and wrongs of the conflict, because most of these people are brilliant people. They're capable of reading a history book. They're capable of educating themselves about the subject. To have such a just one note interpretation, I mean, the most extreme version of this, you get a lot of people in the left space who will say they're working with the three-letter agencies. Their job is to direct people who might be discontented culturally in a certain direction in their views on foreign policy. Now, Occam's razor, I think, you can't prove it. You can't really go there. But the Western chauvinism, I think, is self-evident. I don't know how else to really explain the uniformity of this opinion among people who had been contradicting what they're saying now 5 minutes before October 7th.
No, I think that's right. I mean, and Israel, to its credit, for citizens of Israel, and particularly Jewish citizens of Israel, they do enjoy a degree of freedom and kind of Western style democracy that is very uncommon in that part of the world. And people see this and say, hey, this is something that's worth defending. And
well, that's it. They have completely, I'm sorry to cut you off, but that's it. They have completely bought into the clash of civilizations framing that we saw post 9/11. And this goes back to, if you followed the work of Hitchens at that time, Dawkins, who's still around, obviously, Harris, they totally bought that. And they have a very transactional approach to liberal values. Liberal values should only be enjoyed by people who buy into them, right? And they don't see the people in the Middle East, broadly speaking, as having any appreciation for those values. So why should we afford them and people sympathetic to their cause freedom of speech? When in Gaza, they'll throw you off a roof if you're gay. That's how they think. And that is absolutely a Western chauvinist attitude. And I think it's it's just plainly a racist attitude. Like that certain people are not worthy of these rights because their culture does not, lend itself to what our ideal of a free society is. That's not our call, and it certainly does not justify broad-based indiscriminate violence against those populations, which in these people's minds it obviously does.
Yeah, there's part of me that is sympathetic to the Western chauvinism and Enlightenment ideas are just better than other systems. But I would just, when I see these arguments from the IDW crowd or from others, many people make these arguments. It's just, having gone to Israel, having gone to the West Bank, having read a lot about this conflict and followed it very closely, since October 7th, Israel just doesn't live up to its ideals in any way when it comes to the Palestinians. And I think if they did apply Western Enlightenment ideas around democracy and rule of law and, judging an individual by their behavior, not as a group identity, then there would be no dispute. There'd be no issue. The fact is that it's a race-based society in a way that no other Western industrialized country is. Right. They view race differently than we do in the U.S. In the U.S., it's so much about skin color tone and nation of origin. There, it's a very Middle Eastern country. Just like how Turkey is divided between Kurds and Turks who might look the same, but because of these deeply encoded ethnic differences, there's incredible division in terms of how human beings are treated on a racial basis. In Israel, it's the same kind of religion, ethnic code that is true all over the Middle East. And there's no Western industrialized country in the world where a third of the population, lives with an entirely different rule set that's under military occupation. 15 million people live between the river and the sea, all under Israeli control since 1967. 1/3 of those people live in constant state of military domination to one degree or another, because the West Bank and Gaza are different systems, but still, these are people that don't have sovereignty that live under Israeli rule. That's not true about America. Maybe you could make the argument that Guam or some other territory those citizens don't enjoy the same sovereignty as other American citizens. You can make that argument, but that's 0.0001% of Americans. In Israel, it's 1/3 of the population that lives in this kind of apartheid state. And if Israel was like Italy or Austria or, South Korea or Taiwan, there would be an integration here, or just saying, hey,
Right.
then let the Palestinians have their own country, let them do their own thing. But they can't have it both ways. They can't say that they're a Western industrialized country, but then not play by the same rules of Western industrialized countries that have democratic rights for all of its citizens. A third of the population lives with an entirely different rule set. So, for me, like, I feel like we had it would be nice to debate these issues with pro-Israel advocates, because it's like, I'm in favor of the Enlightenment democratic system, but it's not what's practiced in Israel. It's practiced on a racial basis. That's just not true. That it doesn't comport with Western standards.
Yeah, and I would say even if it were practiced, it's not a license to kill. Like that's the thing. Like they see it as a license to kill. They see their perceived cultural superiority, which is subjective. And look, as a guy who now makes his living running his big fat fucking mouth, yes, I enjoy living in places where I'm free to run my big fat fucking mouth. That doesn't give me a right to occupy and control and police and kill people who don't run their society in that way. And once you take it to that point, it becomes just rank warmongering. And now Israel has taken that to a genocidal scale.
Yeah, well, look, I wish there was a more holistic debate and empathetic debate, and just holding people to their own standards. Like in Israel, I'm sure you've seen, and in the West Bank, there are Palestinians, Palestinian and Jews who live near each other in the West Bank. The Jews, by nature of being Jews, they have citizenship in Israel. They can vote, and when they get in trouble, they go to civil courts. There's Palestinians that are living in essentially the same communities, maybe just a few miles apart. If they get in trouble, they go to military courts. They can't vote for the military that rules over them. And they don't have free speech. If we want to talk about free speech as such an inherent value, like the IDW does, if you're a Palestinian, you post a meme about October 7th, the Israeli military will come and bulldoze your home. Now, if you're an Israeli citizen, if you're a Jewish citizen of those same communities, you can go on. I joined on Telegram a bunch of Israeli chats, and they're very
I could only imagine.
Controversial, to say the least. I'm in one Telegram chat where the people were posting memes of dogs eating the dead bodies of Palestinians in Gaza. And these are Israeli citizens. Are they going to get in trouble for posting controversial or violent memes? I don't think so. So there's free speech for Israelis and no free speech for Palestinians on a racial basis. Who can defend this? I would love to see someone defend this.
All right. So since our time is limited, Keaton, I really want to get in the immigration article. So why don't we go to that?
Great. Yes. Absolutely. I have that ready to go. So you recently wrote an article back in April, because we covered this too, the Tyson chicken plants story. And in this article, you claim that basically large corporations are behind the recent influx in migration across the southern border. So I'll just read briefly from this. When the meatpacking giant Tyson Foods announced plans last month to shutter its pork plant in Perry, Iowa, and lay off all 1,200 employees, it brought rare attention to one of the most influential, less scrutinized dynamics of America's mass migration debate. That is, the role played by large politically connected corporations seeking to blunt wage growth. For this isn't a time of crisis for Tyson. The same day the company made the announcement, Bloomberg News quoted Garrett Dolan, an executive, as saying that the firm had been actively recruiting from the waves of migrants who have ended up in cities such as New York seeking asylum. Tyson Foods, which already employs some 42,000 immigrants, said it had placed some of the migrants to work at its plants in Tennessee. We would like to employ another 42,000 if we could find them, Dolan said. That caused a storm on social media. I will skip ahead here. Tyson Foods is far from alone in acting this way. Many corporations have called for increased immigration as a solution for rapidly rising wages, and several business groups are also pressing policymakers to support programs to extend legal protections to those who entered the country without documentation. Any pro-immigration policies that will be implemented will benefit us on increasing the availability of labor throughout the country, said Andrew Masterman, the former head of Brightview, the nation's largest commercial landscaping company, when pressed by investors 2 years ago on how we would respond to upward wage inflation. And that's whether that's immigrant labor that exists in the country or whether it's guest immigrant labor coming in, he added, according to a transcript of his remarks. We're fans of that. And then you go on in the article to comment that the pandemic tightened the labor market not only by increasing unemployment benefits, but by also closing the border down. Now it seems like now that society has opened back up, it seems like the working class is kind of being hit with this double whammy of inflation as well as an opened border that now is driving wages back down, making labor less competitive than it was in the sort of days and months as the lockdowns ended, where you saw this very tight labor market where we noticed wages increasing. And so assuming Trump is back in office in January, which I think is a safe assumption at this point, where do you think this goes? Where do you think this goes? Does migration drop, and do working people get a better deal out of that? Because I'm always skeptical. I'm always skeptical that the big man will find a way to keep most of his no matter what.
Well, look, I mean, immigration is a tough subject to talk about. I don't like the politics around it, the demonization, a lot of the rhetoric from the right and the Trump world, I find very dehumanizing and cruel. But you look at how the Democratic Party has approached these issues. The Democratic Party, for much of its 20th century history, was fueled in large part by labor unions, and labor unions for the last 150 years have made this concern that's it's raised in this issue a big part of its rhetoric and policy demands. That, just as we were talking about housing is essentially just a market-based issue. If we don't build enough, then prices increase. If we have excess labor, we have lots of labor coming in, especially in terms of low-skilled labor for certain industries. And I don't mean this for the entire economy. Actually, you can make the argument that mass migration helps boost wages among upper middle class for certain sectors of the economy. But for low-skilled labor, for folks who are driving cars and working as janitors, landscaping, meat packing, a lot of these low-skilled industries, there's strong evidence to suggest that mass migration of low-skilled labor helps depress wages. And again, this is a discussion that's very fraught. There's not many people in the Democratic Party, given the shifts of the Democratic Party towards the kind of white-collar Ivy League college professionals away from labor unions that once kind of created the foundations of the party, that will talk about this. They say that any discussion around the potential negative impact of mass migration is racist, is xenophobic.
Right.
But again, this is just kind of like a basic economic question of, we see the way I do a lot of these stories, when you call a big corporation, you call a lobbyist, they'll spin you, or they won't even respond to your questions. One way to actually see intent in terms of big business decisions, if they're publicly traded, is to listen to these investor calls. They kind of legally have to say that anything they say on these calls can be used against them in court. So that they kind of are pressed to tell the truth. And you see these major corporations laying it out there saying, look, we're going to, because of the tight labor markets, because of the restrictions on migration, we've seen wage inflation. We've seen higher wages as low-skilled workers have a better bargaining position. They can't just be easily replaced by other workers. That brings wages up, and mass migration will help decrease the wage inflation. I laid out several examples in this piece. I've got many other examples that I've kind of compiled doing research for this story. And we look at the lobbying disclosures. Big businesses that rely on low-skilled labor, again, meat packers and security guard companies and others, for the ones that are publicly traded and big corporations that are active on Capitol Hill, they're making disclosures all the time that they're prioritizing TPS and legalization reforms so they can legally employ a lot of these people coming in. So if you come in from Venezuela or Haiti without authorization, without documentation, it's difficult for these companies to hire you. Some of them still do, they just don't follow the law, but many of them attempt to follow the law. And the way that they can is that they can lobby the Biden administration to extend legal work permits like TPS, temporary protective services, and then employ them at these plants. It's part of their fiduciary interest to have this kind of flow of migration. I see these right-wing conspiracy theories around, the migration is part of a Democratic Party strategy to, increase votes. I don't see the evidence of that. People can't vote. You vote illegally in this country, you're going to jail. The penalties are very high. It does happen occasionally, but it's exceedingly rare.
Well, statistically, these populations aren't even voting Democrat anymore. I mean, they're about 50-50 now anyway.
You look at a lot of these Asian, Latino immigrant communities, they're vastly shifting to the right. So yeah, like just in terms of the general partisan dynamics, it doesn't make sense. But there's strong documented evidence that there's a big business dynamic here that very few in the press want to discuss.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't know of the correlation between migration increases and increases in sort of upper middle class wages. Does that have anything to do with the fact that corporations profit more when they pay migrant workers less? So like there's lower labor costs, maybe increased profits, so that's more money for middle management. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, there are many studies that just broadly make the argument that mass migration grows the economy generally, that grows kind of the white collar working segment, that tech companies do very well from mass migration, whether that's kind of the Uber model or even big companies like Google and Facebook. They're bringing as many H-1B high-tech visa workers who, by law, they're not supposed to be paid lower than their American counterparts, but in practice they are. It's a very pliable, segment of the labor force. They're bringing these workers from parts of Asia, South Asia, from India, and they're replacing coders who are, very, they're highly paid, and that's making just the company a lot more money. So it's kind of it's raising the wages and the general kind of economic outlook of major corporations. But it's difficult to kind of segment this because there are winners and losers to this debate, right. And it kind of depends on which industry you're looking at.
Well, what you're describing, and this strikes me in a lot of areas, it seems like very often wealthy corporations will use the ideals of the left against it and get them to advocate for their agenda on one basis when really they want it for another. So the anti-racist, rightly so, impulses of the left are used to advocate for an agenda that has absolutely nothing to do with anti-racism. It has to do with corporate profits, and they never put that together.
There's a company here in San Francisco, Mapbox. When there was a kind of in 2017, 2018, there was a trend of tech companies starting to unionize. They attempted to unionize. When they're kind of union advocates within the company who said, hey, why are we moving a lot of our coding and call center bases to the Philippines? That's like a workplace concern. Are you replacing us with lower paid workers, more pliable foreign workers who don't have, American citizen status? The company responded, hey, are you being racist? Yep. Is that, it's like, okay, well, this is just a normal, workplace concern, a labor concern. But the kind of jujitsu move is to say to these college-educated workers who are very sensitive to these accusations, oh, that must be a form of racism for you to bring up these concerns.
All right. Well, that's all the time we got, I think. Lee Fang, tell everybody where they can find you.
LeeFong.com, on Substack. And Russ, Keaton, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the show and what you guys are doing, and really just enjoyed the chance to talk to you guys.
No,
Thank you very much, Lee.
Appreciate that. Yes. Welcome back anytime.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Please clap.